associated notebook for Bride of Feminist.
She said you appreciate it.
Good evening, y'all. My name is Mark McKee, and I'm the managing editor of the Missouri Review. It's my honor to welcome you tonight to the first in-person event of our new series, Miller Conversations on Literary Publishing. With help from a generous Student Success Enhancement Grant from the Office of the Provost, the Missouri Review, now in its 47th consecutive year of publication, is setting out to create a digital archive of conversations with authors, editors, and marketers about the life cycle of a literary work. In the phrase our arts and culture editor Chris Somerville coined, every book has a story. Tonight we are very fortunate indeed to be speaking with Rachel Yoder. Rachel Yoder is an assistant professor of screenwriting and cinema arts at the University of Iowa. Her stories and essays have appeared in publications such as Harper, New York Times, the Paris Review, the Southern Review, and the Sun. Also the Missouri Review, by the way. She's the founding editor of Draft, the Journal of Process. Tonight, of course, we're here to talk with her about her debut novel, Nightbitch. Selected as an Indie Next pick in August 2021, Nightbitch went on to be named Best Book of the Year by Esquire and Vulture magazines, and recognized as a finalist for the Penn-Hemingway Award for Debut Fiction, a finalist for the VCU Cable First Novelist Award, and shortlisted for the McKitterick Prize. A film adaptation of her novel, written and directed by Mary L. Heller and starring Amy Adams, will be released in 2024. There needs no ghost come from the grave to remind you that by 2021, when Nightbitch first came out, we were hip deep in a pandemic, and many of our more thoughtful public voices were coming to the discovery that a veil had been thrown back on actual reality worldwide. Here in the States, the previously obscured structural tenuousness was laid bare from the nature of work, especially people who we came to call essential workers, to the veins of brutality and murder in the institution of policing, to the corroded state of the news media, and I could go on. Thank goodness we cleared all that up. More seriously though, in this way, Nightbitch is a novel of its time. It unveils the structural tenuousness of conventional motherhood, the expectation that unremunerated, often invisible work is painted with romantic bromides about the inspirational joys and satisfaction of raising a child, while erasing the potential for rage and despair, physical damage, and the endless exhaustion inherent therein. It would be an achievement just to make that clear through the enjoyable narration by turns, elegant and bracing. But the imminence and arrival of Nightbitch in the mother's body and psyche, and how she responds, suggests a greater aspiration to our lasting benefit. For me, one of the key features of the novel is the transformation of the mother. The exhortation to hold fast to that transformation, and even more, the challenging assumption of control of that transformation. Far more than a satirical savaging of conventional expectations of motherhood, it charts the genesis of this mother through Nightbitch as a liberated figure of creative and physical power, which in turn elevates the roles of all relations in the family, partners, parents, and individual selves. It doesn't look away from revelation, it leans in, and it starts becoming something else, which makes it a book that we need right now, and will need as time reveals what's next for all of us. It's also really funny. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rachel Yoder.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for that incredible introduction, and thank you for saying that it's funny. Sometimes that doesn't come up. Thank you all so much for being here, for choosing to spend your time here, listening to us talk about literature. Thank you so much to the Missouri Review for inviting me to come here and for being a supporter of my work for over a decade now. So thank you, Spear. Thank you, Sarah Linda. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kylan. Thank you, Mark. Let's see, I'm going to read just a short excerpt from the book, and this comes in the first section of the book. So the first third of the book is really about something that's happening to the protagonist. She's not quite sure what's going on. There are some changes. Maybe she's getting hairier. Maybe her teeth are getting sharper. Maybe she's just anxious. Maybe she is Googling her symptoms too much and spending too much time on WebMD. Who can say for sure? So this comes sort of far along in that first section as some weird things have started to happen. And right before this scene, which is a scene that takes place in the middle of the night, the afternoon before, she and her son were out in their front yard, and a trio of dogs came along, and one of them put her son to sleep as though they were putting her son down for a nap, and she was sort of beguiled by these dogs, and they kind of cast the spell until she snapped out of it and shooed them away. So that is what has preceded this middle of the night scene. Imagine then what force of nature or God or magic it must have taken to exhume the mother from the delicious depths of sleep to which she had descended. Imagine the power it must have required to rouse a mother from her first restful night in years, entire body slack and dead, breathing slowed to nearly not even there, her dreams as real as life itself. She moaned as she was achingly pulled from the molasses of sleep to the clickety-clack of her blood and a stomach sick with adrenaline. Outside the bedroom window, things scratched and snarled, huffed through wet snouts, gurgled and tongued. She sensed bodies moving in a frenzy among and over one another, impatient, anxious, on edge and waiting. Jesus, she thought hazily, what in the fuck? She touched the boy's chest as he snored softly beside her, then rose and threw on sweats. In the kitchen, she grabbed a butcher knife, then thought better of it, and instead went to the hall closet and found the baseball bat. She was tired and enraged and would beat to death anything she found out there. She would kill it with her own hands. She peered out the high window of the door and in the light of the full moon saw them. Dogs. So many dogs. 15, 20. She scratched the coarse hair that now covered the back of her neck and her shoulders, then bared her teeth. She could hear every sound, smell every smell. She eased open the side door and stood behind the screen, looking into the night. The mother smelled her before she saw her, the strawberries and soap of the golden retriever. That's one of the dogs that was there earlier that day. She smelled like strawberries. And there at the top of the steps she sat. Beside her, the pudgy basset hound with her pretty eyelashes, and the collie, her body tensed with energy even in the middle of the night. Behind them, scores of other dogs, more even than 20, she now saw. I know you, she growled at the canine trio, not altogether meanly, but more like, I'll be damned, waking me up in the middle of the night. I really should have been more polite to you today. They had come for her, as she had both feared and hoped they would. They wanted her to join them, to take her, but she wouldn't go. She would not. Something inside her quickened despite her resistance, an elation at the thought of joining them, yet not nearly as articulated as that, more a sense that her body might leap forward and tumble down the steps and out into the night without first consulting her, that she would succumb to the delicious buzz of the late summer cicadas and dewy weight of the pollen-heavy air and be seduced by it, pulled into its warm embrace were she not careful. Besides, what she was seeing simply could not be real, had to be a waking dream, some sort of hypnopompic hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. She shook her head back and forth violently and then shimmied all the way down to her tail, as if she'd just emerged from a pool and was throwing off droplets of water. Beneath her sweatpants, her tail twitched instinctively. She suddenly had independent control of each of her ears, which she moved back and forth to listen to each and every breath and whine and gulp of the dogs. This is not real, she thought as she ventured out onto the porch, then down the steps, propelled by a guttural longing, the polyphony of night noise, so many luxuriant smells. What's to lose? It's just make-believe, a thing she often told her son, just a game. She had left the baseball bat by the door, and once in the driveway, saw that the dogs filled the pavement and spilled out into the street, then back into the pools of shadow darkening her neighbors' lawns. The retriever took her hand as she had yesterday and led her through the sea of animals, each one of them as alert and still as the night around them. In the middle of the driveway, in the middle of the dogs, she was not afraid. She waited. They waited. Then, from somewhere on the outskirts of the fray, a dog let loose with a high and plaintive bray, the first note of a hymn, the mother thought, a call to worship. With the note, the retriever took the cuff of the mother's sweatpants in her mouth and pulled on the material. "Hey, stop," she said, laughing at first and then stopping because the retriever did not let go, would not let go, and the collie started in on the other leg, pulling at the fabric, so the mother had to hold tight to the waistband to keep her pants up. "Stop," she insisted, now more firmly, kicking first at the retriever and then at the collie. They didn't let go, merely held tighter as she pulled against them. "Oh, Jesus," she said. The collie grabbed higher up on one leg, and then a bushy shepherd with different colored eyes started on the other. A muscular black lab hopped up on its back legs and nipped at the hem of her t-shirt, its teeth ripping holes as the lab came back down to the ground, mouth still closed hard on the fabric. She kicked at the dogs and knocked at them with her hands, but more and more teamed toward her. She was jarred to one side, then the other, then forward onto her hands and knees, and there was no stopping them at that point. She covered her head with her hands, and they ripped at her clothing, pulling apart the back of her t-shirt, easily rending the thin fabric of her underwear. It was over as abruptly as it had began. Not a paw on her. She panted on the ground in the fetal position, naked. Her ears twitched, and she could hear only the gentle breath of the dogs all around and smell their exertion. She raised her head. The dogs paced around her, whined and pawed at the ground, side-eyed her, stopped and stared, fur raised along their spine ridges. She curled her fingers against the pavement of the driveway, showed her teeth. Her eyes lit with fire, and she could feel the hair on her head growing, her mane expanding into a monstrous spectacle. The muscles in her haunches rolled. One thought came and then left as quickly. You are an animal. She snarled, then lunged blindly into the throng of bodies surrounding her, teeth searching for flesh. She was hair and blood and bone. She was instinct and anger. She knew nothing but the weight of her body and the pull of the earth against it, the particular wetness of the night air, the bats that flew through her periphery, every movement of the paws and legs and heads around her. She searched the night with her mouth, wanting to sink her teeth into anything. She closed her eyes and became pure movement, pure darkness, a twitch and surge, the animal's first dream. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. That's one of my favorite scenes in the novel, so thank you for being here this evening. The theme of our conversation is the story behind the book, and we've already heard a lot of wonderful stories about this novel, and I would hope that we're going to hear more this evening. I found the book incredibly funny. I mean, I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and sit alone on my couch laughing. But you said, people either find it funny or devastating. And how do you reconcile that? Speak to the extreme responses.
Yeah, I think when I was writing it, it felt very urgent, and it felt very serious and very sort of life and death that I get it out, which makes it sound very dramatic. But I think the way that this protagonist is kind of surviving this intense era of her life is by being sarcastic, by using humor, right? That's actually a kind of survival tool for her to kind of get through the devastation of a complete loss of identity, feeling like she's completely abandoned herself. She doesn't know what self she is anymore. So I think it really kind of depends, where you are in your life when you come to the book. I have some readers who are in their Nightbitch era, and this book is very intense and devastating, and it's hard for them to read. And also women who are 65 and raised 5 kids, and it's still devastating and hard for them to read because they've actually never kind of confronted the loss that came along with that era in their lives. But then at this point, this book came out 3 years ago. I think it's really funny now. And I think, also the director of the film, she really leaned into the humor too. So I'm glad to see that.
So let's talk a little bit about the genesis of the novel. What came first, the character, the concept, or this really strong, infectious voice?
Well, the term Nightbitch came first. It was a joke, an inside joke between me and my husband when I was very sleep deprived. When my son was probably 3, wasn't a great sleeper, maybe hadn't slept through the night, and I hadn't slept through the night in many years. So I was quite feral when awoken at night. So we started joking about Nightbitch, and then the whole I was like, this is a bad idea if I were to turn this into like a literal thing in a book. But the idea just stayed with me. And then I was sitting down to write again after 2 years of not writing. I had my son and just kind of stepped away entirely from this thing that had defined me, for my entire adult life, writing and being part of a writing community. I sat down and I thought I was going to write a book of essays. And I started writing an essay about the lactation room where I had worked when I was working when I had him as an infant before I stepped out of the workforce. And the voice for this lactation room essay, I was like, who is she? Where did she come from? She was real angry, and she had a lot to say. It was just sort of like burning out of me. It wasn't exactly me, as all voices in writing are not exactly you. And I thought, wow, this voice has a lot of energy, and it has an engine. It has a rage engine. And I wonder if she wants to write a book. And she did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once you've found the central story, there are 3 narrative arcs: Nightbitch's transformation, the multi-level marketing mommies, and then the search for Wanda White. So talk about sort of choreographing those 3 narratives, or balancing them maybe, and significant changes along the way.
So I think this is how it worked. I wrote the first third of the book, and it did the thing a short story does where it arced. It had a beginning, middle, and an end. And I thought, uh-oh, I just wrote a really long short story. That's horrible. Like, there's nowhere to publish this. What even is this? Is it a novella, horror of horrors? But there were seeds planted in that, right? There were like these other moms. I'm not sure if Wanda shows up, like if she gets the book in that first third. I think she does. And so I thought, okay, well, I could think of this as the first act of a movie. And at the end of a first act of a movie, you're at the point of no return. You're off on the adventure. And so at the end of this first section, she has, we could say, perhaps turned into a dog, right? Like, it's begun, there's no turning back. We have to move forward with the adventure. So I thought, okay, well, how am I going to take the elements I've already set up in this first third and develop those? I have these other moms, those relationships have to in some way progress. I have Wanda White, that has to progress. I have the husband, the marriage, that has to progress in some way. As for the moms, I had been listening to a podcast called The Dream, hosted by this woman named Jane Marie. And the first season is all about multi-level marketing. It's this deep reportage into sort of where it came from, how scammy it is, why it's so popular. And I thought, oh, that would make a lot of sense. Like the podcast was really a kind of a critique, right, of this sort of lack of community among mothers, and how multi-level marketing provides this opportunity for community, but at the same time, it's a scam, right? And people lose a lot of money on it. I thought, well, I'm gonna just put this podcast in. That seems fun. As for Wanda White, oh man, how much did I want to write the Field Guide for Magical Women? How much did I just want to write that book instead of this book? Wanda White is this academic. She has a book called The Field Guide for Magical Women that the mother, the protagonist in this book, finds. And there are different passages from Wanda White's book in the novel, and they're just all she's like a mythical ethnographer, and so she's traveled around the world and found all these different sorts of magical women, and so some days I just let myself write passages to that book, like what's the next entry in this book. So that was also a way to kind of keep me going.
Your own background, how did that inform the novel? There's this brief 6 to 7 page section, 2/3 of the way in, about the tragedy of Nightbitch's mother's life. And so say a little bit about that interesting section, because it is a departure.
Yeah, so I was raised on a Mennonite commune in eastern Ohio, in the Appalachian foothills. My dad was raised Amish, so I have this big Amish Mennonite family. He was sort of the transitional generation, and then I grew up in this sort of leftover hippie Mennonite commune. It was actually really wonderful. So, ever since I went and got my first MFA, I've had people saying, you should really write about being Mennonite. And I can never do it. It's something that I just never knew what to say. I didn't know how to process it because I was still in it. And so I knew that backstory, or I had a hunch that this kind of conservative, traditional, religious upbringing might have a place in this book with this character. It might be part of this character's story, and sort of explain why she's so unable to say what she wants. She's so unable to articulate her desire to really anyone. She's so out of touch with it. And I thought, well, I don't want this to be a Mennonite book. I don't want it to be about Mennonites. I'm always I'm like, keep them out. I don't want those Mennonites coming in. Not ready yet. So I said, okay, well, there doesn't have to be any backstory in the book except this one chunk. We'll quarantine it. And there will be a moment where, kind of the you might say, the plot climax of the book, very kind of traumatic moment in multiple ways, is where the story sort of breaks and she goes back into the past comes rushing in, and this sort of break in the narrative. And it was actually much longer when I gave it to my editor. It was probably twice as long. And I allowed myself to just write all the Mennonite stuff. And once I worked on it with my editor, I was like, maybe I should just delete the whole thing. Can we just delete the whole thing? We don't really need this, right? And she's like, wait. And so that was probably the part I edited the most and worked on the most and cut it down by about half. I also wanted, the mother doesn't have a name. She's Nightbitch, or the mother. And it felt really, that backstory felt very particular and specific. And I also was really surprised how I didn't know how much Nightbitch grieved for her mother and for the women from her Mennonite background for like the generations of women who never were able to speak their desire, or, you know, they always had to be happy with what they got and they never felt like they deserved to have what they wanted. And so that was a really interesting and beautiful discovery in writing the book, right? That she just really wishes she could have like brought her mother along with her on the journey.
All right, let's totally shift gears.
Let's do it.
Okay. Editing and publishing. So once this novel is finished, it goes to your agent. Your agent sends it out. And so was it snapped up immediately? Was there any resistance? Was there, you know, any ask for revisions, changes to the title? Any
Yes,
of that?
all
Okay.
of that. Well, first of all, when I sent it to my agent, she said, what I'd like you to do is get an actual calendar, like a blank calendar out, and go through your book and put it on a calendar. So it has to exist in real time. And I was in agony when she said, I'm like, no, please don't make me do this. Because it's really easy to just kind of have things happening and, you know, they might not kind of be attached to a specific timeline. So that was actually a really great exercise. Everything existed in time and space, which is pretty important for a book. So we did that and then sent it out to maybe a dozen or 15 editors. And this was in like January of 2020. And we got some early no's, which was not surprising. And then there were 2 editors who were really interested, maybe like 10 days after we sent it out, 2 editors who were interested. So it happened really fast. And I spoke with one of them. She had a lot of great notes. She had a lot of great ideas about how to develop it. And the title had to be changed if she was going to buy it. And then the other editor said, well, you know, it's never going to be on an Amazon banner if it's called Nightbitch. It's going to be an indie book, but I agree that it's really important that this is the title. And I was like, thank you. So I went with Margot at Doubleday because we kind of had a meeting of the mind. She like understood what I was trying to do. She understood sort of the reason for the audacity of the title.
Yeah, so once you start working with Margot, yeah, what changes then took place?
Right. So like I said, we worked a lot on this kind of flashback that happens right in the middle, a lot of just cutting that back, paring it back. We also worked on pulling those threads, so like the multi-level, the MLM mommies, and I think also Wanda White, they didn't come until further in the book, and she said you have to pull those into that first third of the book, like start the timeline sooner. And that was really helpful, right? Because then it made it all seem like it was woven together. And so that was really the most of what we did. I remember she also asked me, the last sentence of the book has the word miracle in it. And it's in reference to the protagonist's son. And she said, do you really want the word miracle? It has such biblical connotations. And I was like, yes, I want the word miracle. Yeah, but it was a rather painless process. I mean, it was agony, like the last read through. We were just like, I cannot possibly read this again. You know, it's like physically painful to read it. That was a lot. But I mean, this all happened. So I sold it, you know, right before the pandemic. So all of this was happening during the pandemic.
Right. So let's talk about the pandemic as if everyone wants to. Publishing, you know, it was a strange time for publishing, but your book did really well.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think in some ways I was lucky, right, that I wrote a book about maternal rage when, you know, a lot of America was just in the throes of maternal rage. And it was just kind of crazy how when it came out, there were also these articles about moms getting together in parking lots to like scream in the middle of the night. There were these moms in Pittsburgh who were like, had a, weekly scream or howl. I mean, things were getting sort of feral. I don't know if you recall, but it was a real weird time. And I think people were open for the weirdness. I think, we had also just come off of a Trump presidency, and I think there was a lot of rage, especially among women, like this feeling of utter helplessness that this is like the president of our country, and what it felt like to be a woman in a country who had elected that sort of leader. I just think we were feeling all of that, and so I guess the book was in some ways helped by that, but it still has legs. Like, people are still reading it, and I think, when I was writing it, I told myself I never had to show it to anyone, because it felt like I was being really bad when I started writing it. It felt like I was saying all the things you're not supposed to say. I was feeling ways that a good mother wouldn't feel. And so it really was, like the first third of it was just written in secret. Like, this is just a project for myself. And I think there's been a lot of relief from a lot of readers who feel brought into community by this book. Like, oh, you felt that way too. I thought I was the only one, because we had become so isolated in the pandemic, right? Like, we weren't meeting up, we weren't seeing each other, and so I think it was a way of being in community with other mothers. Like, this book kind of provided that outlet.
Did you, during the publishing process, make any discoveries about publishing that you didn't know? Or did you get a peek behind the curtain? Or,
I mean, okay, so this is one thing I discovered. Obviously, I didn't have a book tour because this came out in July of 2021. So I was doing a lot of Zoom events, a lot of interviews for print outlets. And before you're published, you sort of have this fantasy about being an author, right? That's going to be so incredible to, be on a stage and talk to Chris from the Missouri Review and have people be interested in your writing process. And it was great. But at a certain point, I realized, oh, what I like about being a writer is writing. Like, that is actually the joy of being a writer. And all of this other stuff isn't writing at all. It has nothing to do with writing, and actually you're using a very different set of skills when you're, being a public person. And so that was interesting, right? That it kind of popped that fantasy that, oh, it's going to be this, this great like public life. It's like, actually, I'd like to just write now by myself with no one around.
so any advice for first-time novelists? I mean, perhaps be prepared that you have to cultivate this public self.
I mean, I think you don't have to cultivate. My advice is, if you don't want to do interviews and you don't want to be a public figure, then don't do it. I was willing to do that, and I think, for my next book, I don't think I'm going to be as willing to do so much. Like, I said yes to everything, like from the I did a Zoom with like 3 people in Illinois who like, the guy was like, so how's it feel to be famous? I'm like, what are you talking about? It was so awkward. Like, so I said yes to everything, and I think now I'm just not as willing to kind of grind in the way that I grinded for the first book. And I don't think you have to do anything they tell, like the publisher tells you to do. Hopefully Margot will never listen to this, but yeah, I think setting your own terms is actually really important for your own like self-care and longevity as a writer, like being really clear on what's important to you and what you want to do, what you're willing to do.
What do you envision Nightbitch's future to be? After the boy is grown, she's still going out, taking these night prowls.
I mean, that would be rad. Yeah. I mean, what's perimenopausal Nightbitch? Is that like the next book? I think, she is someone who has transformed into a fully articulated self, someone who has a core, who has a gravity to her and isn't afraid anymore of being exactly who she is and saying exactly what she wants, which is harder, I think, than one might imagine for women in particular, to say what you want. Especially as a mother, when you're kind of not supposed to have any wants, you're supposed to sort of just like give yourself over to the family and the needs of the family. So, yeah, I mean, I hope she's still running around out in the woods. Yeah,
I do too. So I think that's a good place to stop. So thank you, Rachel. Mark McKee's going to come up, and we're just going to have a few questions from the audience, and then we have a lovely reception outside those glass doors.
When you were talking about the book going to a movie, who did the adaptation and how much input did you have in that?
So the director, Marielle Heller, who also did the movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood about Mr. Rogers. She did The Diary of a Teenage Girl, which if you've seen is very tonally tricky, and she pulls it off masterfully. She's a writer-director, and so she came on and did the adaptation, and very generously, after she had written it, gave it to me and said, "What do you think?" So she was open to kind of like being in dialogue with me about my thoughts. She also had a lot of questions about sort of Mennonites and what they look like, like what they look like, what they would wear. So that was really fun, but it was pretty minimal. And honestly, like I wanted her to feel like it was hers, like this is her work of art she's making, and it's different than the book, and it's really none of my business to a certain degree. So it was like a very nice working relationship where I didn't have that much interaction. I went out to set for a few days and just kind of hung out and, had an anxiety attack. Yeah, and so she's just been really magnanimous and was great to work with.
I was wondering if you could talk on one of the more heartbreaking parts of the book, which for me was the cat scene.
Oh boy.
Why did the cat die?
Rachel loves cats.
I do love cats. That was one of the first conversations I had with Marielle, with the director. It was over email. At the end, I was like, P.S., I just want you to know I'm a cat person and I love cats. And she was like, thank God. She's like, I am too. What do I do with that scene? I'm like, God bless, good luck. Like, do what you will. Yeah, that scene is probably one I question the most, and I wonder if I wrote it correctly, because it's really over the top. And there's just a lot of questions I still have about it, but I do think it had to happen because she's a dog and she lives with a cat. She's like a feral dog. So really though, how I wanted it to work narratively is that sort of comes in the middle of the book. It's sort of the midpoint. And I wanted something at the middle of the book to kind of wake her up because she's sort of in this like feral dog, like, I don't know, she's just like playing and she's just like running wild, and there's no sense of her kind of using that power and that energy to sort of advance. She's just kind of being angry. And I was like, she can't just be angry the whole book. And so what's going to kind of snap her back into reality? And I think it was, for me, I wanted that to be the point where she sort of went over the edge and scared herself. Yeah, and people really don't like that scene. Yeah, it's a tough one. Did that make you want to stop reading?
No.
Okay.
I'm in my Nightbitch era right now. It's almost like every single second of that book was way too real. Like, are you narrating my life? It's really freaky. You know? Like, I can see myself almost like, now we're gonna run away and catch a squirrel. Like, I almost see it going to that level, like, very easily. Just outside the library, which is where I am all the time. You know, it's so real. And I'm in a book club with friends from work, and they're not mothers. And it's great to talk about it with them, but I'm foisting it upon my like weird mom friends. Like, you have to read this immediately. I have to talk about it with you immediately. It's very urgent. And I'm like, it's a manifesto. Like, what do I even mean by that? I don't know, because I need to talk to other mothers, like directly, like one-on-one. And I wonder if you have that kind of like, you've been talking to other mothers for the last couple of years about it. Like, are people like, this is what, I read it almost as like a handbook, which is extreme given like what the actual content is. And I just was curious if you could speak to that at all.
I am so glad you're here. Thank you for coming. You are my people. So thank you so much. Yes, I feel like I found my people after the book came out. And they were people like you who came up and were just like, oh, you know, like, Nightbitch, or just would start crying. I'm like, I get it, you know? And I think it has opened up this conversation. I mean, I've talked to book clubs, rooms full of women. My first in-person reading was in Des Moines, and it was just like 70 women, and like half of them were crying, and there was like a raw steak. I mean, everyone was like so unhinged. It was incredible. It was incredible. So yeah, I mean, you know, now I feel like there's this whole kind of movement from like early motherhood, let's tell the truth about it. And now there's this sort of like perimenopause, let's tell the truth about it. Like midlife, let's tell the truth about it. And you have like Miranda July's new book, which is sort of like, comes after, you know, the Nightbitch era, is this sort of midlife crisis era. But I like that. I feel like I've come into a community of women who can be honest with each other and don't have to be like the MLM mommies who are like, we're perfect and, you know, our shit's together. It's like, actually, our shit is not together. And can we just be real with each other, which is what we all really want, I think. So glad you're here.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that some of the movies that inspired you was A Woman Under the Influence. That is one of my favorites, and one of the things I remembered when I watched it, I had to stop a lot of times while watching it because it was so intense. And I was just wondering if there were any specific scenes or just the movie itself that inspired you to write how to write the character or even the story, and if you wanted to include that type of intensity in your book.
I think what I saw in that movie were these extremes, right? That she was actually this really brilliant mom when she was kind of plugged in and engaged and sort of brilliant around the house. But that at the other extreme, she was just totally negligent, you know, like having a mental breakdown. And just the fact that she like descended into that was really scary to me, because I did feel like, you know, feeling so alone in early motherhood. And there's this intensity of like your body changing, your hormones surging. Like it feels, for me, it just felt really out of control. And that movie captured that out of controlness. That was scary to me. And so I think as I was writing Nightbitch, I had that sort of in mind, right? That you're allowed to have it be a little scary, which felt transgressive to me. You know, like you're not supposed to have a scary mom book. But I went for it, yeah.
I think we're all waiting for some radical entrepreneur to
have a t-shirt that reads, "What would Nightbitch do?" Help. Well, that wraps it up for the Q&A session. Thank you all again for being here for this lovely conversation, and thanks to Chris for a lovely interview, and thanks most of all to Rachel Yoder one more time for her.